technology is always evolving, which is improving our ability to control industrial emissions.
Toxicologista, epidemiologista e pesquisadora sobre os impactos da poluição atmosférica na saúde das pessoas. Estamos falando da norte-americana Deborah Proctor, que é referência mundial no assunto, especialmente em problemas voltados para doenças respiratórias e também câncer de pulmão. Estudiosa da matéria há 25 anos, ela atuou como consultora de um projeto que a Ufes vai realizar, que estuda a relação entre os casos de asma e a quantidade de material particulado. Déborah recebeu a equipe de ES Brasil para essa entrevista exclusiva. Confira.
I live in the Los Angeles region, where we have a very high level of concern about air quality. That is because weather conditions at some times make it such that the air pollution is concentrated, and we have a very high amount of vehicle traffic, which is a very significant source in the Los Angeles area. It varies across the country. I think there's a very significant emphasis in areas of California and in Texas and in the Northeast, in New York, New Jersey area, and less so where there's smaller populations, Montana, less of an interest. But where there's large populations and a lot of vehicular traffic, there is a more significant concern. And also in areas where there's a lot of sunshine because of secondary ozone generation, so the Southwest, there's concern. I would say more so. I think more in Texas and California than most other states is my observation. Well, in the United States, we do a tremendous amount of monitoring of the air and measurement of emission sources. And then we combine those data into computer models to predict airborne concentrations. And then we compare the concentrations predicted by the model to what has been measured. And then to the extent we need to correct the model with measured information because we haven't correctly estimated sources, or there might be secondary sources that haven't been taken into consideration, then we need to correct the models. And then the models are used to predict air pollution, and then we institute controls to ensure air pollution levels are as safe as possible. Well, the air in Los Angeles used to be so brown you could hardly see it, see through it. And now the air pollution is so much better. It's so visibly, obviously different. But controls on vehicles is probably the most important change that has occurred. Improved technology to reduce emissions, more emphasis on electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. And then we use better gasoline formulations. In California, we have gasoline that's only for summer and gasoline that's only for winter because we need to keep the airborne concentrations down in the summer because there's so much sunshine. So improved gas formulations and improved emissions on cars. Also, I think in the United States, we check cars, especially older cars. Every 2 years, they have to go in for emissions tests, and if they don't pass, then they can't be registered, they can't be licensed. So I think that that's a really important way to control emissions is to have regular testing, particularly on older vehicles. Oh, certainly. There is a tremendous change in the control of particulate emissions as well as gas emissions. But since we're most interested in particulate emissions here, in the United States, we went from very simple cyclone type technologies to bag houses and HEPA filtration. And I'm even working on a facility right now that's installing ULPA filtration for outside emissions to the atmosphere, which is technology that's usually used for a clean room to clean, for microchip production. Now it's being applied in at least one situation where there is high pollutant emissions in a residential area to control emissions. So technology is always evolving, which is improving our ability to control industrial emissions. It probably represents inaccurate emission estimates and the lack of accounting for secondary sources. For example, you can get fine particulate matter formation like PM10, PM2.5 from reactions with nitrogen dioxide. So the secondary sources may not be accounted for entirely, or the emission estimates may be wrong. Sometimes emissions are thrown off by things such as a ship passing through a channel. The emissions that coming from the ship aren't accounted for in the emission inventory, but they can be very significant. So I think that the main problem is with the emission estimates. I don't specifically know the answer to that question, but I think, generally speaking, control of mobile sources is the key. Emissions from vehicles are the most difficult to predict, and so the improvements that we can have on vehicle emissions and limiting the number of vehicles on the road, limiting the number of times they stop, traffic congestion, for example, when a vehicle is moving, its combustion is more efficient than when it's stopped in traffic. So improving traffic is probably one way in which we can improve air quality. But why that doesn't happen is multifaceted, right? It's always money and politics and different competing interests. Different competing interests limit, progress, and that's the truth in every place. So, but that's probably where most improvements could occur. Most of the emission limits are really set at the state and local level. So although the EPA can set a specific limit, states can set even more stringent limits if they would like. It's acceptable. So the net outcome of this announcement is difficult to predict. Also, some automobile makers have said they're going to continue to move towards the Obama administration goals, regardless of what the limits are, which I think makes sense because, 3 years we could have a different president with a different perspective. So they're thinking ahead. And finally, the administrator of the EPA just resigned last week because of wasteful spending. So, things are always in flux. And hopefully a balance will be reached and reasonable limits be set and implemented. But fuel efficiency is very, very important for controlling air emissions. Oh, well, I'm a toxicologist, but I guess probably electricity would be my best guess. Certainly we can be pleased with improvements in air pollution, but there are significant hurdles still to be faced. I think in the United States we have a particular need to understand pollutant interactions and understanding sensitive subpopulations, whether or not there are populations that are at greater risk of disease and that the standards were not necessarily protective of populations that are particularly susceptible. So although we can be pleased that there have been improvements, there is still clearly room for greater understanding and better work. I think that's internationally the case. that probably varies depending on where you live. I feel that air pollution is, maybe I'm somewhat biased, right? My area of interest is really focused on human health, and so I feel that air pollution is possibly the most important issue. At least in the United States, water quality is very good, certainly there are concerns about pollution of the food supply and of surface water, but we all breathe every day, all day long, and so having good air quality is extremely important. So I don't know if I could rank them, but personally I would say probably that air quality is the most important, but I'm sure a water scientist would argue with me. So. Oh, that's a tough question. I think that there's a lot of information, a lot of being communicated in the United States. In highly developed countries, there's a huge amount of communication about air quality, constant information feed about air quality. And I don't know that the same level of communication occurs in Brazil. So that rather than having like measured data, perhaps people what they can see becomes a reality, right? So should we be more concerned about black dust in the air, or should we be more concerned about pollution from cars? Well, we can see the black dust, and so that's certainly a very high priority, right? Whether that is really the most important issue associated with health effects is not known. So, we need to study this in order to better understand. And I think maybe with more understanding and better communication, there'll be less unrest about air quality, less uncertainty. Well, it's hard for me to know the perception of the community, but my perception is that air quality is pretty good. You're in a very good area in Victoria with the ocean breeze, keeping the air relatively clean, but there is definitely sources of pollution that I can observe when I go on a walk. I can see, I can smell the air pollution from the cars. I can't necessarily smell air pollution like that from cars in the United States. So my perception is that the air pollution is at least more obvious to the senses. And then I can see the industry. I can see, the smoke coming from the stacks. So, my perception would be that that's a source as well. So I think, my perception is that there are sources that could probably be better controlled here. And so that's something to be accomplished. So probably a couple years ago, ArcelorMittal asked me, because I have interacted with them on other environmental research programs, what assessment could be done to determine the causes of asthma among individuals, or how can we study the air pollution and not just look at associations, because it's difficult to say, we have an increase in ozone and we have an increase in asthma, but we also have increases in other things all occurring at the same time. So what is really the cause is difficult to know from association studies. And all of the epidemiological studies that have been done in here to date were all ecologic design or association studies. And they asked me what type of research could be done. So I said that we could do a different type of study. We could do a longitudinal study where we monitor children over the course of time, and we monitor air pollution effects, and we collect a lot of data points. We collect data points multiple times during the year from different children, from about 100 children. And we can use that information to better identify the causes of childhood asthma associated with air pollution. And to do this research, though, obviously we need to work with physicians and clinics and the universities. And so we went to them with a general idea of a plan to do this work, and then they developed a protocol for the research to be conducted. And my understanding is that ArcelorMittal provides the university with the money to do the research, but they have no control on what exactly the study plan is and how the information, and the results. That the university is in charge of disclosing the results entirely. And there also is a public communication plan that has been developed as part of this to set up a website to provide environmental monitoring data that's to be collected and the results of the study as they're being generated. And the only element of the study which would be considered confidential would be personal identifying information of the children. So we certainly cannot identify who the children are, where they live, that type of information. Only the physicians would know that information. But otherwise, the information to be provided would be widely dispersed and, with no restrictions by the company whatsoever. And I assume that the university also has that requirement, that like in the United States, there's no restriction when a university takes money from any type of a grant. If it's coming from a private sector, there's no restriction on their ability to publish and present the results. And I believe that's the case here as well. I see that there are grants. Grants are definitely being provided by private industry. It's very common in the United States, as a matter of fact. And government grants are becoming more restricted. So it's being more difficult for researchers to get money. And so the competition for research grants is very high. Grants from industrial companies are significant. And sometimes they are structured by the courts, where a company will have to set aside a certain amount of money specifically for research, and then that research is managed by a nonprofit organization, and then they hire even in the United States, even the tobacco industry has to fund the research through private grants or through grants that to improve respiratory health. Well, that's a good question. I think that that everyone in society needs to work on the issue of air quality. You know, we drive cars, you know, when we could drive more fuel efficient cars. There's clearly many, it's not just industry. So in California, we did a large air pollution study. It started in about 1980 in Southern California. It's called the MATES study, and we're on the 7th version of MATES. I think what we learned in that study, and are continuing to learn, is that vehicle sources are extremely important. The most important sources of air toxics and air pollutants, at least in the Southern California area. And so to the extent we could reduce emissions by better gasoline, better vehicles, better roads, we will make a greater difference as far as controlling air pollution. Mm-hmm. Now, every community and area differs, right? We have differing industrial sources. In Southern California, in particular, we have a lot of oil refineries. Here, there's a lot of metal processing. So every situation is different, but it's important to consider that there's many sources and that we could improve in all areas, I would assume. And I think that studying this area, the area around Victoria, is very important because it's different than many other areas because you have a different type of industrial pollution source with a very large steel mill and a very large iron ore processing operation in close proximity to the city. So you have a different potential sources. So I think that this is an area of particular interest to study and understand the interactions between air pollution, common air pollutants and industrial source emissions. This area. I think that the research that Ufes is proposing to do here is state of the science. This is the study design and the level of investigation is first class research. And I believe that we will be able to better understand the causes of asthma among children as a result of this research, and thus better control the most important sources. Well, in California, we consider it extremely important to control the quality of fuel because, you can have different emission products. If you have a lot of aldehydes in your emissions, it's very irritating to the respiratory tract. It's a potential, cause of respiratory disease. So I think fuel quality is a very important consideration, yes.